Hello everyone, my name is Sophia, and for those of you who don't know me, I am a nursing student. I will be graduating this December 2020 with my BSN. So in this video, I wanted to talk about how I got a 90% on the TEAS exam. So for those of you who don't know, the TEAS exam is an entrance exam into nursing school. So some schools require the TEAS exam and some schools require the HESI exam. For my school, they required the TEAS exam. And it's really important that you do well on this test because nursing schools look at this score quite a bit in order to see whether you would be a good candidate into nursing school. For my school, your TEAS exam score counted about 50% into your admission score, so they really wanted high scores on this exam. So today I'm going to talk to you about my tips and tricks for getting a 90% or higher on this exam. This exam is a very doable exam. I am somebody who is horrible at standardized testing. I have always been my whole life, and I still managed to do well on this test, and I believe you can too. So without further ado, let's begin. So starting off, the book that I used to study for the TEAS exam was this ATI TEAS Secrets by Mometrics, and I really loved this book. I felt that it had some wonderful practice exams, and it had really good practice questions for each section of the exam, like reading, writing, and I felt like this book had a lot of good explanations as well for each subject. For science especially, they had really good information over each system, and for reading, they talked about different types of passages and the differences between like primary and secondary sources, so I really recommend this book. Okay, so the first section that I'm going to be talking about is the reading section. So for the reading section, you have 53 questions and 64 minutes to complete all of the questions. So the reading section is pretty much like your standardized testing for your state exams, like in middle school and high school. So it's just basically reading passages and then answering questions like comprehension questions. So the way that I studied for the reading section was doing practice passages. I wanted to get really good at being able to read quickly and being able to answer questions in the time frame that I would be given on the exam, because I'm not a very fast reader. I tend to read very slow, so it was important for me to read practice passages in order to get a hang of reading very quickly and being able to comprehend the passages as well. Another tip that I have for the reading section is definitely know your different types of passages. Is this an expository? Is it a persuasive? Because you might get questions like that. So knowing your types of sources and knowing your types of passages are really important. Another thing that I recommend for the reading section is that you definitely do want to read fast, but you also want to make sure that while you're reading it, that you are comprehending the passage. Because you don't want to just skim over the passage and then not have a really good idea of what that passage is about. And then you're just having to reread it over again when they're asking you certain questions like, what was the main idea of this passage? Or what was the tone of this passage? So I would definitely say make sure you are comprehending what you're reading. Go at a faster pace, but don't like skim over it to the point where you don't really have a good idea of what that passage is about. So the next section that I want to go over is the math section. So for the math section, you have 36 questions and 54 minutes to answer each question. So for the math section, I found that this was a very easy section. I am somebody who is terrible at math. I only took up to like algebra in high school. I didn't even take pre-calculus, so I'm not good at math, and I still did really well on this section. So for the math section, you just want to be very familiar with like your fractions, your decimals, and your percentages. Like just memorize the simple rules as to like how many decimal places you would move to go to like a percentage and vice versa, and be able to like convert from like improper fractions to like decimals, like super easy stuff. Order of operations, area, volume, things that are really basic. And if you aren't really familiar with those, there are a ton of videos online on how to do different types of math problems, and I think that this section would be pretty okay. The only thing is that on the exam you will get an online calculator. They won't give you your own personal handheld calculator, and sometimes we're just more comfortable with the handheld calculators. So I recommend that when you are studying for the math section, practice doing questions with an online calculator so that you get good at like clicking and you're just really familiar with an online calculator, because sometimes it's kind of annoying using the online calculators and having to click around, so just be familiar with an online calculator. But other than that, the math section is quite simple. Just do practice questions. The Memetrics book had some wonderful math practice questions. They basically explained how to do every type of math problem. So again, I really recommend this book for the math section. Okay, so the next section is the science section. So for the science section, you have 53 questions and 63 minutes to answer the questions. For me, the science section is the one that I did actually the best on. I do really like science, so maybe that helped, but I feel that this is a very doable section. I know a lot of people get very nervous about this section, but I think that it's a really important section and you want to do well on that one because a lot of your nursing classes are going to be very, very science based. So for this section, I recommend studying by using the Memetrics study guide and also using some of your notes from anatomy class. The Memetrics study guide had a lot of great information about each system for anatomy and physiology, and a lot of good information over chemistry and microbiology as well. So how I recommend studying for the anatomy and physiology part of the science section is by making a one-pager or maybe 2 pages if that's a really complicated system over each system. So the main things that I believe you need to know for each system is 1, what is the function of that system? 2, what are the main structures in that system and components of that system? And 3, how do those structures all work together? And I think as long as you focus on these 3 things, you should have a really good foundation of each anatomy system. So for example, let's take the cardiovascular system. So the purpose of this system is, we know, blood flow. The heart is pumping blood to the rest of the body. So you have your function down. So second, you want to look at the main structures of the system. So for the cardiovascular system, the important structures are obviously the heart, all the blood vessels like the superior vena cava, the aorta, and then the lungs, because the blood goes to the lungs to be oxygenated. So now you have all of your structures of that system, and now it's just putting that all together. So now you want to know, like, how does the blood flow through the heart? Where do they go to which vessel? And what's the difference between these vessels? Like, what are the difference between veins and arteries? So that's how I would study for each system. And then after you have that down, after you have the function, the structures, and how all those structures work together, then you can focus on some of the details as well, like maybe cardiac cells, what are some of the characteristics of them, and so on. Another example is like for the respiratory system, maybe you could make a one-pager and draw out like the lungs and the bronchial tree and how it branches out into like the alveoli. So after you draw the lungs and the bronchial tree and you know like the functions of each component of the respiratory system, then you can just focus on little details here and there. So that's how I would study for the anatomy section. Just know those 3 things and then you should be good for each system. Another thing that I recommend for the anatomy section of the science section is not going too in-depth but not being too shallow either. So for example, like let's take the endocrine system. You want to know the function of like the major hormones, but you don't need to know exactly like what are the characteristics of somebody, like how would they present if they had too little of this hormone or too much of this hormone. Instead, you really just want to know, okay, so this gland secretes what hormone and what's the function of that hormone. You want to be very familiar with the major concepts of each anatomy system without getting too specific. For the chemistry section, I would recommend studying a little bit less for this one since there are definitely more questions over anatomy. Instead, for the chemistry section, just know your protons, your neutrons, and how to calculate charge. I really don't feel like the chemistry section is too hard. I think as long as you know your basics from your chemistry prerequisite class, you should be great on this section. I would also say that before you study all of the anatomy systems, have a good understanding of the cellular cycle and the components of a cell. So maybe draw out like an animal cell and then label all the different components of it and the functioning of each of those as well. You also want to be familiar with mitosis and meiosis. If you have trouble with some of the mitosis and meiosis steps and the whole cell cycle, I recommend watching some videos over that. There are some great videos over the cell cycle and mitosis and meiosis and transcription, translation. There are some great videos over that on YouTube. For me, when I was learning those things in class, I had such a hard time trying to comprehend how all of these cycles work together. And so looking at YouTube videos and seeing the animations really helped me learn some of those scientific processes. Another thing that might be helpful for the science section is if you have time making flashcards over certain topics that are really hard to kind of memorize, like for the endocrine system, maybe like making flashcards over the hormones might be helpful instead of just trying to memorize them by reading them. Also, another good way to memorize some really hard scientific processes is to take a whiteboard and just write down, you know, all of the different steps over and over again until they're kind of memorized and they stick in your head. Okay, so moving on to the English section. For the English section, you have 28 questions and 28 minutes to answer each of the questions. So that's about 1 minute per question. I found that this was actually the hardest section for me. I actually scored the worst in this section. I feel like this section can be a little bit tricky, but there are some ways you can study for it. So be really good with like your grammar. Definitely know your different types of like adverbs and pronouns and prepositions. And if you're not really good with those, there are a ton, again, of YouTube videos over each of those English topics. Also, like your different types of sentences, like simple and compound complex and punctuation. Those would be really helpful to know for the English section. And I think as long as you do practice questions on the English section, you can get probably really good at it and start picking up on what they like to test over. Also on the revision questions, maybe just focus on the ones that sound very concise. Those would be my tips for the English section. Just make sure you know highlights of like grammar and punctuation. And if you aren't really sure about those topics, just, you know, Google them or watch some YouTube videos over them. I think one way I could have done better on that section was just doing more practice questions over it and watching more videos over certain topics. Instead, I kind of just focused my time more on the science section, but doing practice questions over the English section could be very, very helpful. And my last tip for just doing well on the TEAS exam in general is to, you know, visualize yourself doing well on this exam. One thing that I did before the exam that really helped me get in a good mood before the exam was I wrote on a flashcard, "I am so thankful and grateful that I made a 90% on the TEAS exam." And then I visualized myself, you know, coming out of the exam and how I felt like I did really good. And so being positive is really important. And don't worry if you feel like you haven't studied too much for this exam. I spent about a month studying for this exam, but I definitely think it's doable to spend less time studying for this exam. If you have trouble with certain topics, you can always, you know, reference to your professors. You can look back at your old notes from your prerequisite classes. And other than that, I hope you guys do really well on this exam. And if you guys have any questions over the TEAS exam or nursing school in general, I'd love to answer your questions. And please subscribe for more videos over nursing school and let me know what type of videos you want as well related to nursing. Alright, well that's it. Thank you guys so much for watching. Bye.